history of the United States of America, decade by decade. 1770s, it all began here, sort of. The foundation for what would become the United States had been building for centuries, ever since the first British settlers arrived. What started as small, struggling groups of settlers eventually grew into 13 thriving colonies. These colonies, however, were angry. They were tired of being taxed by the British Crown, and when their cries for reform went unheard, they had no choice but to declare independence. On July 4th, 1776, that's exactly what they did. Of course, the British didn't take kindly to this. The first shots had already been fired in 1775, but with the colonies officially in rebellion, they faced the full might of the British Empire. Outgunned, outarmed, and seemingly without hope, the Americans, led by General George Washington, defied the odds, keeping the fight going far longer than expected. This perseverance carried them into the next decade. 1780s, as it became clear that the American forces weren't giving up easily, the conflict gained the attention of other countries. The French, longtime rivals of the British, saw an opportunity and even sent some soldiers to aid the Continental Army. Though the war dragged on, the Americans' surprising victory at the Battle of Yorktown set the stage for a peace treaty. By September 1783, the British, tired of the rebellion, signed a treaty recognizing the United States of America as an independent nation. Now that they were their own country, the challenge was to figure out how to govern it. The first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was a mess. It treated the 13 colonies as separate entities with only a loose central government. Rebellions and tax conflicts showed that the Articles weren't working, leading to the Constitutional Convention. After intense debates, including disagreements over slavery, the Constitution was approved. The next step was selecting the first president, and naturally, George Washington, the war hero, won unopposed. 1790s Washington took office, determined to avoid political factions, but his ally Alexander Hamilton's Federalist idea sparked the formation of parties. When Washington had to quell a rebellion by Western settlers protesting liquor taxes, Hamilton suggested executing the rebels, but Washington vetoed that. The rebellion was put down, demonstrating the government's power. Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee joined the Union, strengthening the country. However, not everyone was happy with the growing power of the federal government. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison created the Democratic-Republican Party in opposition. Washington was re-elected in 1792, but shocked everyone by announcing his retirement, setting the precedent for presidents to serve no more than 2 terms. This paved the way for John Adams to take office, and tensions began to rise. Adams faced increasing opposition from France, Britain, and Native American groups. To consolidate power, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and criminalized criticism of the government. This backfired, energizing the opposition, and in 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams in a peaceful transfer of power, a precedent that would stand for generations. 1800s, the transition of power marked the beginning of a new chapter. The United States was still small, but that changed in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, which nearly doubled the size of the country. This acquisition, along with Jefferson's trade embargo, signaled that the U.S. was becoming a major player on the global stage. However, the embargo was deeply unpopular and hurt the economy. This decade also saw personal drama, with two founding fathers. Vice President Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. The Constitution was amended to allow the president to choose their own VP rather than inheriting the position from the runner-up. Jefferson's second term ended with significant accomplishments, such as the Lewis and Clark expedition, the invention of the steamboat, and the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Some states began abolishing slavery, though it remained entrenched in the South. Jefferson's protege, James Madison, took office in 1808, and his presidency began with a calm period, but it soon escalated. 1810's George Clinton, who had stayed on as Madison's VP, died in 1812, just as the U.S. faced its biggest crisis yet. Tensions over expansion, British support for Native American insurgents, and trade conflicts with Britain escalated into the War of 1812. The U.S. struggled against a British naval blockade, clashes with Canada, and the burning of Washington, D.C. The war tested the young nation's resolve, and its outcome would shape the future of the United States. But never count out a Yankee. Led by General Andrew Jackson, the Americans fought back against the British troops and even captured the Spanish territory of Florida. A peace treaty ended the war, and Madison, easily re-elected, prepared to retire. Over his time in office, he had lost two vice presidents, Elbridge Gerry, who died only a year into office, and added two new states, Louisiana and Indiana. Madison's close ally, James Monroe, succeeded him in 1816, continuing the Democratic-Republican streak. Monroe's presidency saw the addition of three new states, Mississippi, Alabama, and Illinois, while the Supreme Court strengthened federal authority over state laws. Monroe was re-elected unanimously in 1820, but the era of the Founding Fathers was drawing to a close. 1820's Monroe went down as one of the most successful U.S. presidents, adding Missouri and Maine to the Union, as well as Florida as a territory. He issued the Monroe Doctrine, signaling an end to European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. However, His successor would determine his legacy, and that would be a complicated affair. The leading candidate was the fiery populist Andrew Jackson, still riding high off his military triumphs. But despite getting the most votes, Jackson didn't win the majority in a four-way race, and Congress instead chose John Quincy Adams, the son of the former president. This was a highly controversial decision. Adams took office amid controversy, and his vice president, John C. Calhoun, a staunch defender of slavery, didn't help matters. His presidency began with tragedy, as his father passed away on the same day as rival Thomas Jefferson. Adams' term largely proved inconsequential and ended the same way as his father's, with Andrew Jackson defeating him in a re-election bid. Jackson's own term began with tragedy, as his wife died of a heart attack before he was sworn in. This personal loss seemed to harden Jackson, as he quickly made his mark by ordering the removal of mass numbers of Native Americans to make room for settlers moving west. It was Andrew Jackson's country now. 1830s Jackson's presidency was marked by conflict, one after another. The issue of slavery continued to intensify, with many northern states outlawing it, and escaped slave Nat Turner leading a bloody revolt that killed over 50 people. The Supreme Court overturned some of Jackson's policies on Native Americans, but Jackson ignored these rulings, continuing the mass removal of tribes, a tragic chapter now considered one of the worst acts of genocide in North American history. Jackson also faced a major challenge when South Carolina passed a decree nullifying a protectionist tariff passed by the government. A standoff between the government and the insurrectionists backed by John C. Calhoun ended with the nullification doctrine being withdrawn and Calhoun resigning as vice president, but the issue remained unresolved. Martin Van Buren replaced Calhoun, and Jackson was re-elected, expanding presidential powers. Conflicts in Texas and Florida intensified as those areas became battlegrounds. In 1836, Texas rebels lost at the Alamo, but by the end of the year Texas declared independence. Samuel Colt invented the revolver, and Arkansas officially joined the Union. Jackson's popularity helped Martin Van Buren win the presidency, but Van Buren's term would not be smooth. 1840s Harrison, at 69, tried to appear strong by giving his inauguration speech without a coat in chilly weather, but then got sick. A month later, after braving a rainstorm without changing his wet clothes, he died just 31 days into his presidency. His vice president, John Tyler, became president, but no one could agree on what that meant. Congress argued that Tyler was only acting president, while Tyler himself believed he held the full powers of the presidency. Harrison's cabinet resigned en masse, and Tyler's presidency was mostly uneventful, with a few key actions, including the annexation of Texas and the start of the Oregon Trail. Tyler wasn't renominated by the Whigs, and James K. Polk won the next election. Polk would make a significant impact. Under his leadership, the country expanded massively, adding Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin as states. But it wasn't a smooth ride. Texas annexation led to a 2-year war with Mexico, resulting in the U.S. gaining even more territory, including California. The issue of slavery flared up again, especially with the Dred Scott case, where the Supreme Court ruled that Black people had no rights the country was bound to respect. Polk's presidency is considered successful, but his declining health led him to decide not to seek re-election. He was replaced by Zachary Taylor, and the gold rush began, signaling the start of a chaotic new decade. 1850s. Zachary Taylor took office amid the ongoing battle over slavery, with the Southern states pushing to maintain the practice and the North advocating for its abolition. The Compromise of 1850 was designed to prevent civil war, offering the South significant concessions, including the passage of a new Fugitive Slave Act that made it easier to extradite escaped slaves back to the South. However, Taylor's sudden death, just a year into his presidency, led to the ineffectual Millard Fillmore taking over. While the compromise passed, it did little to ease tensions, especially after a fiery speech from the ailing former Vice President John C. Calhoun. Fillmore's presidency is largely seen as a footnote, as he was replaced by pro-slavery Democrat Franklin Pierce in 1852. During this time, the battle over expanding slavery into new territories intensified, resulting in violent clashes in Kansas. Tensions even spilled into Congress when abolitionist Charles Sumner was beaten with a cane by firebrand Southerner Preston Brooks. Pierce's presidency was considered a failure, and he was succeeded by James Buchanan, whose inaction as the country teetered on the edge of collapse did little to stem the crisis. Minnesota joined the Union during his term, but economic struggles and the rise of radical anti-slavery figures like John Brown, who led violent attacks against pro-slavery forces, dominated the decade. Amid this chaos, a new figure emerged: Abraham Lincoln. Known for his debates with moderate Stephen Douglas, Lincoln became the Republican candidate for the 1860 election. A chaotic four-way race, including Douglas and Buchanan's Vice President John Breckinridge, allowed Lincoln to triumph. Fearing the loss of their way of life, the South began to plan its secession, and Buchanan, as president, could only watch as the country fell apart. 1860s. Even before Lincoln took office, the country was descending into chaos. Most southern states, starting with South Carolina and including Texas, voted to secede from the Union. They elected Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederacy and an attempt to enshrine slavery in the U.S. Constitution failed. The Confederate forces, though newly formed, were determined and launched attacks on U.S. Army bases. The Civil War officially began, with fierce battles breaking out in Pennsylvania. Simultaneously, Lincoln faced tensions with Native American tribes during the Dakota War, as well as growing unrest in the North, where riots broke out over the first military draft. Lincoln responded by imprisoning suspected Confederate sympathizers, but his presidency hinged on one thing: victory. After several major Confederate victories, the tide turned in favor of the Union, largely thanks to General Ulysses S. Grant's strategic brilliance. By 1864, the South was on the ropes, and Lincoln narrowly defeated General George McClellan, partly thanks to the support of his new Southern Vice President, Andrew Johnson. During his second term, Lincoln succeeded in adding West Virginia and Nevada to the Union, routing the Confederacy, and securing the surrender of General Robert E. Lee. He also pushed for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But just as Lincoln's second term seemed promising, tragedy struck. He was assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth, becoming the first U.S. president to be murdered. Andrew Johnson assumed office amid national outrage. He quickly began reversing much of the progress Lincoln had made, particularly in terms of Reconstruction. Johnson was lenient toward the South, scaling back Reconstruction efforts, and although two significant amendments aimed at improving civil rights passed, Johnson showed little interest in enforcing them. The Confederate states began rejoining the Union. Alaska was purchased, and Nebraska became a state. Johnson's lack of action led to his impeachment by a Republican Congress, but he narrowly avoided removal by just one vote. Johnson did not run for re-election in 1870, and Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency. 1870s. Grant's presidency focused on restoring many of the Reconstruction principles Lincoln had introduced, but problems persisted, particularly in the South. Once the Southern states were readmitted, they quickly passed laws that segregated and restricted the rights of Black populations. A terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan, emerged, targeting freed slaves and Northern sympathizers. At the same time, Chicago was devastated by a massive fire that killed over 300 people, and New York was engulfed in corruption under the Tammany Hall political machine. Despite these challenges, Grant had enough goodwill to easily win re-election in 1872. His second term saw continued conflict with Native American tribes, expansion into the West, and another economic crisis. During this time, Colorado became a state, but Grant's presidency was increasingly viewed as more successful as a general than as a leader of the nation. 1870s. Was it time for a change? The Democrats shifted their approach in the 1876 election, nominating anti-slavery Northerner Samuel Tilden against the relatively unknown Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden appeared to have won decisively, but Hayes contested the results, and an electoral commission awarded him several disputed states, giving him the presidency. The country teetered on the brink of conflict once more, until a compromise was reached, ending the military occupation of the South in exchange for their acceptance of the questionable results. Hayes' presidency was largely uneventful, marked by Native American conflicts like the Nez Perce War, and the first commercial light bulb being invented by Thomas Edison in 1879. Hayes did not seek re-election, and James A. Garfield replaced him after a very close election. 1880s. The 1880s brought more turbulence. Garfield, shortly after taking office, was shot by a deranged gunman, eventually dying from botched treatments by his doctors. He was succeeded by Chester A. Arthur, who focused on civil service reform. The American West became synonymous with lawlessness, with events like the gunfight at the OK Corral and the deaths of notorious figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James. New institutions like the American Red Cross and Tuskegee Institute were founded, and the Washington Monument was completed. Arthur chose not to run for a second term, leading to the return of the Democrats with Grover Cleveland, who won the presidency decisively over James G. Blaine. Cleveland, a fiscal conservative and reformer, saw his term dominated by labor unrest, including the Haymarket Square riot and the founding of the American Federation of Labor. In 1888, Cleveland won the popular vote, but lost the electoral vote to Benjamin Harrison, with controversy surrounding the election. Under Harrison, the U.S. saw the opening of tribal lands in Oklahoma, the addition of 4 new states, and devastating events like the Johnstown flood. However, by the end of the decade, the country was once again on the brink of change. 1890s. The 1890s were marked by reform efforts, including the passing of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the founding of the first major suffrage group, led by women seeking voting rights. New states like Idaho and Wyoming were admitted, and Yosemite National Park was established. However, the treatment of Native Americans remained horrific, as evidenced by the Wounded Knee Massacre, where nearly 300 Lakotas were killed. Labor unrest continued, culminating in a large steelworkers' strike. Harrison's presidency, although competent, was marred by the questionable legitimacy of his election. In 1892, Grover Cleveland made history by becoming the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He defeated Harrison, but his return coincided with another economic depression and increasing militant labor actions. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson ruling in 1896 legalized segregation, while significant developments like Henry Ford's first automobile and the Alaskan gold rush took place. Cleveland stuck to the two-term rule, and in 1896, Republican William McKinley defeated populist Democrat William Jennings Bryan, ushering in an era of U.S. imperialism. 1900s. The dawn of the 20th century saw McKinley secure his second term with Theodore Roosevelt, a controversial progressive, as his running mate. The two defeated Bryan once more, and McKinley's presidency was marked by the U.S. becoming a world power. After the explosion of the USS Maine, the U.S. declared war on Spain, swiftly defeating the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. As a result, the U.S. gained Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and annexed Hawaii. McKinley, considered the most imperialist president up to that point, was assassinated in 1901, paving the way for Roosevelt to ascend to the presidency. As the 20th century unfolded, the U.S. stood poised for change, but darker events were just around the corner.